be speaking on GDPR and some of the basic principles and pardon me, and how they may apply to some practices you may have in place. But he also touched on the idea that I'm the usual presenter. So if you've been following our webinars over the last 6 months, yes, I've been making an appearance here or there. So to be fair to everyone joining today, whether you're new or been with us before, I'm going to share a little bit more about myself and who I am. But I've been with Sucuri now about 3 years plus going now, and born and raised in Miami, Florida. So if you're local, happy to share the city with you. I love Cuban coffee. Anyone who's tasted it or enjoyed it knows the immediate benefits of having such. Hoping that fuels me today. Also, the proud new parent to 2 new kittens that stumbled on my front door a couple of weeks back. And as I know, cats and the internet seem to sort of go hand in hand. Figured why not introduce them? So there they are on your left-hand side. But to the task at hand, why we're here. So, Val mentioned, of course, the frenzy about GDPR and the new standard that was put in place about 6 days ago. What I kind of want to key in on during our presentation today is sort of, what the basic principles of it are. I mean, the requirements themselves are long and complex, right? So there's not going to be a single solution that will ultimately address and help with the entire regulation as a whole. However, there are aspects of it that can be simplified, right? So better understanding and might be putting you in a better position as an organization or as a business to ensure that you remain compliant. Second item we'll touch on will be, how that may compare to another common compliance regulation most e-commerce businesses follow, which is the PCI data security standard. And then at the end, I'll touch on a number of items that'll be essential suggestions and best practices that can apply to both, right? So understanding if you have a habit built in already, just extending that habit to accommodate what the GDPR is looking to address is ultimately going to be very fruitful for you. So let's start, of course, with the basic idea, right? Who does the GDPR apply to, right? I mean, so most have this broad understanding, and I've seen some confusion on this, that this is an EU-based thing, so those in the union ultimately are going to be the ones that have to worry about this. But it's not entirely true, right? So if you process data as an organization, business, shop, whatever it is that you accomplish with your online presence, if you process data that includes those that belong to anyone living or working within the EU, then you actually will be held to those aspects of the initiative as well. So an example would be a US company that might collect data from European-based members or even employees as such. You have to fall in line with the GDPR standard as well. So keep in mind, so understand your audience, understand who works for you, and this is going to be something that will have to apply to you if you do have any presence over in that part of the world. Chris Hodson was combing through a lot of articles, over the last few months, just better understanding. And CSO Online is actually a really good online website for security news and stuff like that, if you want to look over there. But Chris Hodson had this really interesting quote that I liked. It's part of sort of what the principle that's mentioned in the Regulation 5, but I think it's a very succinct summary of what we're looking to accomplish. GDPR is concerned with ensuring that organizations have a legitimate legal purpose for the collection and processing of personal data, right? So that's actually really well put, I think. I think it's understanding that as someone who may visit and provide information to, to Amazon or to my security vendor or another provider, I want to ensure that the data I'm providing has a legitimate legal use and that it's being processed correctly. So I think a good foundation as to where we're starting and why this is a very important initiative moving forward. This data privacy and protection becomes a larger topic of conversation. In terms of the questions to ask yourself around these 2 particular points, what are we doing as an organization? These are probably the 6 questions I think that'll probably best help you understand internally, if you haven't already, what you're doing as an organization. If the GDPR may not necessarily apply to you, but you're here to understand it more thoroughly, this may also have some good understanding for you as in terms of what you're doing with the data of those that you collect it from. So let's start with the first one, right? Do any visitors that you're collecting data from, and as I mentioned, including employees, reside in the EU, right? So you have to understand that citizens or those at work, this is something that'll apply to you even if your organization or your company is based outside of the union. So whether you're an Indian-based company or working out of the States, if you can answer yes to this question, that you have to worry about this as well. Second question, do you have a process for breach notification? It's really important. You have to understand that part of what we mandated will be here is that any information or anything that can identify an individual that then has been breached then has to be notified to either your base or to the individual themselves. So do you have a process in place to, of course, be notified of it, and of course, then address that with the people impacted? Next question, is your organization aware of what personal data means under this new GDPR standard, right? And how to properly handle that data? I would say that this is really key. The GDPR, and I might have overlooked describing what it stands for, General Data Protection Regulation. This is not an IT, this is not a support or an engineering issue. This is an organizational issue, okay? Anyone that has access to any type of data that can personally identify someone, an individual, needs to be, have to understand the policies the organization has in place so that we can better be aware of what we need to be doing, right? How to handle that data, who should have access to it, right? Well, we'll dive into this more, but I just want to hammer this point. This isn't IT issue. This is organization issue. Question 4, have you given the visitor the right to access their information, right? So if someone comes asking about, where the data is and what is being stored, do you have a way to be able to deliver that data to that particular individual free of charge, of course? So that's something to keep in mind. 5th question, does your organization have a process for erasing a visitor's data at their request? Online, you might see phrases like the right to forget. Essentially, that's what this is. The right to forget information, the right for a visitor to come to an organization and say, I would like you to scrub the data that you have pertaining to me. And so this kind of goes back to some of the other things about your organization that we'll touch on. Can you access it? Who has it? And where can this be done? Question number 6, does your organization hold and process data only if it's absolutely necessary? And I think this is really important. I think a lot of different organizations and businesses do their best to just collect as much data as possible, right? What data can work for us? Let's stash this data here in this file server and figure it out later. Well, at this point, especially when it comes to data privacy and protection and the increasing threat of breaches, I think it's really key that we evaluate the risk of having data that we don't absolutely need. So this type of what will be risk assessment, and we'll touch on this on the end, is important, right? Because if you have, it's no different, and I'll make this analogy for website developers and owners. If you have software and plugins and tools that are not being used and are just, running out of date, if you don't use it, you should lose it. Same applies here with data, right? So data, I keep throwing this word around, but what applies and, under what specific things are we looking for data? Well, the GDPR and the PCI data security standard have 2 different definitions, right? And we'll go dive a bit now into sort of how they compare and contrast. But under the GDPR, you're going to see that very thorough definition of what data is, personal data. And ultimately, it's just anything that would identify you as an individual, your name, whether it's your location, and general account number. It could be your phone number. It could be an email. Anything like that. Anything of that nature is personal data. Okay, and so we have to think really broadly about all the data that we're collecting as it pertains to an individual. Let's compare that to the PCI data security standard, right? We're more focused in on card holder data. So at minimum, this could just be your primary account number, banking, routing, credit card, whatever, method that is, but it could also be the name of the card holder, it could be expiration date, addresses, but still it's very specific to card holder data. So, PCI data is included under GDPR, but it's not necessarily the other way around. So that's just one key differentiation there. But let's go a little further, right? What are, we compare these two major compliance regulations that are very prominent. How do they differ? Where do they differ? Well, first things first, of course, are, understanding the scope, right? So we just touched on the data, like what are the differences are there. But the regulations themselves are also very different. I would say one thing understanding is GDPR will describe the requirements that you'll need in order to achieve compliance. Whereas PCI will be more specific, right? They'll explain how exactly you can achieve that, what expectations are you can meet in order to gain compliance for those specific requirements. So GDPR is a bit more broad, so yes, it's more complex. PCI is a bit more narrow-minded or narrow-focused, I should say. But in doing that, it can actually help you working toward GDPR compliance. Fees, of course. The fees for GDPR, if you haven't heard of those already, are quite large versus PCI, which vary. But one thing to note: if you're found in breach of both, and remember, a breach in PCI data security standard will mean essentially a breach under GDPR. The fees will basically stack on top of each other. Okay, so if you're found in breach of both, that is big trouble. So let's make sure that you're addressing both needs. And I'm hoping at the end of this presentation, you have tools and resources in order to effectively get both done. Now, the two do cross paths, right, in a number of ways. And so what I'm going to do now is sort of go through a number of examples that'll allow you to better understand where PCI data security requirements and those practices can help toward at least taking a step toward compliance with GDPR, right? I don't want to confuse you. Because you're compliant with PCI does not automatically mean you're compliant with GDPR, but some of the practices that you exercise under being compliant with PCI can help, all right? So moving along, let's touch on a few examples, right? And this will be the basic structure here. You'll have a GDPR article on the left, and you'll have a PCI security alignment on the right. And we'll go, the descriptions here will more key on the italicized part, so I just want to focus on that. But let's talk on the first, right? The principles relating to processing of personal data, right? So we'll go to the description, one of the descriptions in Article 5. Processed in a manner that ensures that the appropriate security of data, including protection against unauthorized and unlawful processing, is included, and against accidental loss, destruction, or damage. So let's key in on something there, right? Protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing, right? So meaning if there's been a breach or a lack of or an improper use of that data. Well, under PCI, when we talk about some of the measures placed along strong access control measures, there's a particular aspect where to remain compliant there essentially means that you have some of these procedures in place, especially when we're identifying your payment terminal, gateway, processor, and where that data is stored and inspected. Because you're protecting against unauthorized processing on cardholder data, if you just extend some of those practices out, or any of those tools that you're using across all data, can help you in alignment towards making sure that under this article, you can argue, of course, that yes, I'm doing what I'm perfectly doing to protect against unauthorized access of this data, and ultimately loss and damage and all that. Another example will be data protection by design and by default. And this will be another key phrase you might see a lot, and because it's sort of like a good banner phrase, right? Data protection by design, but more importantly, by default. By default, right? So this is something just moving forward we have to understand, we have to protect against, making sure that we have solutions in place that validate permissions granted to users or those who have access to the data, making sure that we're auditing any events in which that data is changed or it's been illegally accessed, it's to the data under the GDPR. Well, but this falls right in line with that PCI alignment and requirements and cardholder protection by design and by default, right? So it mandates a daily review of your security events and logs to ensure that cardholder data is properly controlled. Well, I mean, if we just expand that and remove cardholder PII data to ensure that all data is properly controlled, you've taken your step towards ensuring that you have the proper protection by design and by default. Moving onward, sticking to Article 32. one of the subsections there is the security of processing, right? So the ability to ensure ongoing integrity, availability of the reliance of those systems and services. The integrity of that system processing that data and all that. Well, that aligns right with the second main section of the data security standard, which is on requirements 3 and 4, securing cardholder data, making sure that the data at rest is encrypted and in transit over public networks as well. So maintaining the integrity of that data, right? Availability of that data, so that even if in the case like this, the data is breached, it is encrypted, right? So encryption is going to be the key here. So this will be something where a practice you might have in place to secure cardholder data will help you on the other side as well. The aspect of Article 32 is the regular testing, assessing, and evaluation of your technical measures to ensure the security of that process. That's essentially the entire requirement 11 of PCI Data Security Center, right? You're regularly monitoring and testing, those systems, identifying risks and potential access points that may be unauthorized. If you're already doing this for your systems to address cardholder data, or maybe it's built out to address data in general, well, that is an aligned, perfect, good step where you can ensure that you're properly testing and evaluating the effectiveness of that, right? So you're starting to see, right, there's a lot of bleeding in terms of how one practice can definitely help with the other. And one of the things we actually addressed in some of the questions, right, is risk, right? Making sure we minimize risk. What data do we have? And the last example I sort of want to touch on is just that. Article 35 on the GDPR is essentially data protection impact assessments. You see there, right? Essentially is an organization or business will assess the impact of any type of processing or that is likely to result in high risk and the rights of the individual. So idea realistically being impacting the type of data that you have and the process in which you have it and what risk that carries to those that data belongs to. Under the data security standard, that's no different than maintaining a security policy that deals with the same issues, right? And in fact, PCI, as mentioned earlier, will give specific guidance on that. So an example of what they'll ask for, of course, is performing annual inspections upon changes into your environment. So have you made any migrations in your systems or tools? Have you acquired another business in which you're absorbing more data? Have you relocated? So is that affecting, how that data is stored? The next example there is identifying, really important or critical assets, threats to those assets, the vulnerabilities involved. And lastly, resulting in a formal documented analysis of the risk that you're seeing there, right? So if we're already analyzing the risk to remain compliant under PCI DSS, then in a sense, we're already doing a similar analysis of risk for the GDPR. One thing, of course, is, keep saying this, is expand your scope on that. So if we're only now analyzing risk for, cardholder data under PCI, well, what do we need to do to expand our risk assessment across the board? And if we can do that, without having to take too many new measures on, then great, we've already addressed that. So we're going to go into some best practices now for compliance. And a lot of this might just be me regurgitating what I've mentioned so far, but they're important keys and they're important practices just as an organization that you can use. If you're not necessarily going to be compliant for the GDPR, or maybe you'll be moving toward a new business or initiative that may not be compliant for PCI or have a requirement for, these are still good policies to have, and just in terms of data protection. So I'll go through each of the ones right here, but I feel like they're pretty self-explanatory. And so, of course, the slides that will be made available at the end, you'll be able to gather this list. But create a policy on how long data is stored, right? So it can be deleted as soon as the threshold time period for that storage is reached. Essentially, going back to one of those first few questions, how long are we keeping this data for? What is absolutely necessary to have it for? We can dictate that and know that, then we can have the policy in place that'll have answer questions for individuals about, well, how long are you keeping this data? All right, well, we have a policy, we keep this data for 90 days. Great. And so we know at 90 days, we have a policy in place to remove that data from our storage, from our file server, mobile devices, whatever it is, however it is that we're managing this data. Provide access to the data only to those intended to access it. So I would tell you that some developers or front desk, clerks don't necessarily have business accessing financial data like a financial controller should. So that's going to be one key point to understand. And in fact, to that point, in terms of who should access that data, you're also going to You're also going to hear a bit more about if you're a larger organization, addressing data in mass or evaluating data in mass, the appointment of a data protection officer. So that will be someone, of course, that will have to be included in this conversation. So if you're an organization large enough to warrant that position, then that's absolutely something to consider. Moving on, making sure you're monitoring those that are accessing those systems, and the data itself, making sure that we're, again, auditing changes in order to identify anomalies or unusual events relating to the handling of that data. So if something happens, being able to identify that, establishing a workflow to warn those data protection officers or whoever else you need to alert, whether it's a sysadmin or anyone else, about the integrity of that data being compromised or breached. Ensuring that the data that you have is rendered unreadable anywhere it's stored. So that could be portable media, backup drives, logs, wherever it is that you have that data physically located, making sure that it is rendered unreadable. This is something that's specifically dictated in the PCI DSS, something that absolutely helps in your GDPR compliance. And essentially, it's the encryption of that data, right? We touched on it earlier, data at rest and all that. And finally, and I kind of want to keep highlighting this one, the internal assessment of the data your organization collects, right? Create an assessment of risk for that. Identify whether there's an actual need to store that data. If you don't use it, then lose it. It's ultimately going to be something that'll pay dividends down the line. So you guys don't, things don't get slipped through the cracks. Like if you can properly identify the data you have, then you know what you're looking for. And then if you know what you're looking for, basically you run through this list again, right? Okay, you know how long it needs to be stored for, who should access it, et cetera, et cetera. So having said that, thank you for the time. I hope everyone took something away from here, whether it's a good practice or an understanding that everyone under your roof is under the same page. Just remember, this isn't just an IT issue. Like people like to, deflect a lot. This is organizationally, everyone should be on the same page and know what this means and how to best handle data that we're ultimately responsible for. With that, of course, that means Sucuri as well is committed to the protection of the data we collect. We've taken measures, of course, to ensure we're compliant, including upgrades to our products and workflows, to our contractual terms of service and privacy policies, which are readily available on our site. You'll have my email at the end. If you need a direct link, you can reach out and we can provide that after the webinar. And as well, we've done extensive reviews of our existing processes to ensure that we're meeting and exceeding the requirements mandated by the GDPR. Of course, some of you may require this. If you need a data processing addendum, there's an email there at the bottom that you see at gdpr@sucuri.net. It's the best place to reach out and even ask anything related to our compliance or anything that you may need related to this initiative. With that, I will hand it back to Val. And I'd be happy to address any questions. But before doing so, just want to make sure if you want any more information about other things related to GDPR or PCI compliance, which we talk on regularly, we do have a newsletter you can subscribe to. It's also available on our blog on the sidebar in which you can register. So Val, with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, that was a lot of information. Very good and very useful indeed. I've posted the link to our newsletter for anyone wanting to register and make sure they have future security news updates. The first question that kind of came on very early while you started talking was, this all sounds very tiresome to keep up with. Do I need an internal team or can I hire external companies to help be GDPR compliant? And because there were two questions kind of asking the same thing, I'll join the other one here, the other half. Somebody asked, May 25th has passed. Is it too late?
All right, let me answer them in the order you asked. In terms of having to have a team or having a third-party service come through and help ensure that you're compliant. If you do not have the time to dedicate to properly vet through your existing processes, the systems, and what your architecture is, I would encourage reaching out to whatever that service may be, or even an organization or anywhere that can have someone come in and help provide that analysis. It may cost a bit, it may require an investment of some sort, but it likely is not as great as the risk of being penalized under this new initiative. So I would say yes, whatever you feel you must do. If you feel you don't have the resources internally to handle this, reach out. There's going to be people who are going to be willing and wanting to help to ensure that you're compliant. Is it too late? No. And I know that people think it's a hard date, and we all obviously strive to sort of meet the deadline as closely as possible. But there was discussion already. Of course, there's going to be some type of a period to allow people to continue to make refinements to their policies and such. That's the course of it. What's important is that you're not caught when a breach occurs. So it's not too late. Start now. Figure out if some of these questions that I raised, raise an eyebrow to you, and you're like, you know what, I didn't consider that. Go back, revisit what you have to, and if you have to update an existing policy that you thought was good and maybe it wasn't, do so. The faster you do it, the better off you'll be. So it's never too late. It's only too late once you're penalized, right? Once you're caught. So make sure that you get that done as quickly as possible.
Yeah, you were talking about penalties, and actually the next one is exactly that. How much are the fines if we don't?
So the fines are large. The fine can be up to about 20 million euros, or 4% of your company's annual revenue. Okay, so and that's whichever is largest. So think about that, right? If going back to the first question, if you don't want to be slapped with a 20 million euro fine, I would definitely recommend spending probably a lot less than that to ensure you're compliant across the board. So those are the numbers you're facing. They're large. PCI compliance fees seem reasonable when you hear those numbers, but like I mentioned, if you're in breach of both, you got to pay both. So it's something to consider.
It's real.
Yeah.
Our personal email is another one. Our personal email is also considered private information.
Yes, anything that can identify or even indirectly lead to an individual is data that you need to be concerned about. So if you're collecting emails and first names, you have to make sure you're compliant under these new standards.
Okay, that's good to know. A longer question here. Please allow me to read it. My company is based in the EU and has a large office in India. Employees in the Indian office can view the personal data of EU citizens. How can our Indian office comply with GDPR?
Well, consider what your existing workflows are, right? Where you may have an office in India, but is the data stored there? Is it not? How is that data processed or accessed? Is it, through encryption or otherwise? There's going to be some phrasing here about like a gap analysis of risk in terms of what you can do there. So I would definitely conduct that and see, okay, if I do have employees that work outside or an office that's outside of the union, making sure that that the data is still located properly, encrypted properly, and only accessed by those who should. It could be entirely possible your Indian office doesn't need to directly access the data, in which case that's great. But otherwise, make sure you understand what the risk is. If you do have a workflow in place that allows them to access the data inappropriately, then you need to work on addressing it.
And just in time for one more, is a ransomware attack classified also as a data breach?
It depends. So let's consider what a ransomware attack is, right? Someone has gained access into your systems and then they've made your data content unreadable because they've encrypted it. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the data has been taken anywhere or data has been, made even understandable to the attacker. Ransomware is just about making sure someone's holding your information at ransom, regardless of what is inside, and they will ask you to pay that Bitcoin fee or whatever it is, and to unencrypt it. But it's tricky because it's possible that they did take the data and then they encrypted it anyway. So it's a case by case. Does not necessarily mean it is, but it can. And so it's always important to make sure that if you are, you have proper process analysis in place that you can identify whether that breach did lead to a public, essentially, disclosure of that data to the attacker. And if you did, then you got to go through those steps, right? You got to disclose that and go through that workflow afterward.
Yeah, we're really short on time, but I will still get one more that just arrived. Question here is, if we use your firewall to block traffic outside the US for security purposes, how's that affect, or is that affecting GDPR for them?
Well, so the question is if you block traffic from the US or from outside the US?
So I understand that they only allow traffic from the US and they block everything else. Is that affecting them GDPR-wise or not?
So with our firewall, remember, we're just a pass-through, right? So yes, and this might be a longer conversation. You can email me and we can have a better conversation about it. But it can address, certain aspects of that data, but ultimately the data is still living on wherever your host is, right? So fine, you might have Sucuri in front, you might be blocking anything but outside traffic, but have you spoken to your host about whether that data is, accessible or hosted on a server in Europe? Things of that nature, right? So that's a layered question. I would be happy to answer that with more detail. The email's right there. Be happy to, but that's just a better insight. So does not necessarily mean so. There are multiple actors involved, but I'd be happy to walk you through it.
So that conversation can continue at victor@sucuri.net, I'm sure.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much, Victor, for your time here. Thank you, everyone who participated today. Again, after so much frenziness with GDPR, we hope to kind of go into a slower, understandable mode. We are available, as Victor said, if you guys need help in this direction. Again, I'm mentioning this for the ones who joined later. We are recording this webinar, so we will be making it available on our website. Also, Victor will be uploading his slides to our SlideShare account, just as usual, so you can find it there. Again, reach out to him if you need any help directly into that topic. And with that, thank you very much. Have a great, starting of a weekend. Thank you, Victor, again for taking time.
My pleasure. Happy weekend, everyone.